perfect position to tell us a bit more about this. Can you kick things off by just giving us an overview on Electron as a company?
Yeah, sure. So Electron, we're a clean tech company based out of London, founded in 2016, and we provide a flexibility market platform. So as you said, we're allowing the providers of flexibility, the assets like EVs, batteries, and solar, and their aggregators to trade with the DSOs, the network operators, who are increasingly needing to create more capacity on the network. So we're that marketplace for transacting energy by time and location to help alleviate those constraints.
Perfect. Well, can you tell us a bit more about the problems of capacity constraints and how flex markets can be used to solve that problem?
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, a really good analogy for this is the internet, I would say. You know, they're both networks. One sends information around, the other sends energy around. And just like the internet, you know, when that started out, it was dial up and it was slow. And to roll that out, it was digging up the road and laying cables,
Yeah.
pretty thin copper cables. And that meant that we got internet, but it was slow. And then to create broadband, faster internet, we dug up the roads again and we laid more cables. And then we did it again with fiber optic. So it is a network problem. It's a bandwidth problem. I think the key difference, though, is that unlike the internet, you know, if you upload too much data or you watch too much Netflix, nothing bad happens. It just slows down or it stops. But if you push too much clean energy into the grid or any type of energy into the grid, things start to set on fire. So it's quite different in that way. And that's why it's so important that we figure this out. And that's why these constraints, these bandwidth problems with energy are so important to solve, because it has a material impact on us as consumers. With the lights coming on and the energy system working, it depends on there being this reliable and safe network. And that's where this extra dimension comes in. And that's why capacity is so important. We need to make sure that there is capacity on the network to handle this energy that's flowing through it. And the big change, obviously, is that increasingly all around the world, more and more energy is going to be powered through renewables. So generation will be increasingly from solar and wind. And in most countries, that's going to increase dramatically over the next decade. So this creates a couple of interesting challenges or opportunities that, you know, on the one hand, renewables are intermittent. It's sunny, it's windy, it's not. So there's a bit more unpredictability in the network. And they're distributed. So they're not in a few discrete places. They're all over the country and all over the world. So where that energy comes into the grid can be really important and often isn't always aligned with where the demand for that energy is. You have tons of wind farms in Scotland where it's very windy, but it's very rural and there's not a lot of people to take that clean energy from the grid. So this is the kind of the opportunity, we would say. It's the feature of the new energy system. How can we make the most of these new clean energy resources? And that's where flexibility really comes in. It's allowing for the grid to handle that more variable, intermittent sources of clean energy, and to incentivize people. You literally pay them to change their behavior to create that capacity. So a really good example would be excess wind. So sometimes it's too windy and the grid can't handle it. There's too much clean energy flowing into the system, and thinking about bandwidth again, the physical wires are unable to take that amount of energy unless they would become too hot and it would cause physical problems. So what you can do is A, turn off the wind farm, waste all the clean energy and pay a lot of money to do that. Or you could B, use flexibility, which is incentivizing consumers to turn up consumption and absorb that clean energy, that abundant clean energy. Avoid turning off the wind farm, pay the consumer for increasing their consumption, charging their car or things like that. So it's a really great example of where flexibility is addressing this problem. It seems a problem, but we'd say it's a feature and it's an enduring part of the system. So like, you know, like DFS is an example. A lot of people think that this means in the future we're going to have to eat our dinner in the dark by candlelight, and that's how we help balance the grid. And it's true, but also we'll be getting paid to turn up, and there's a lot of positive benefits to the energy transition and to this new renewable system that maybe isn't so obvious yet, but that's what we're trying to unlock and enable, because it should be an enduring part of the system.
Absolutely. And like you said, there's, I think, just so much more demand coming onto the grid. We definitely need to think of really innovative and reliable ways to balance that. Um, so if people read around Electron, one phrase that will keep coming up is the open ecosystem thesis. This is something I think that's really important for anybody who's not aware. Can you describe for me again, like what the open ecosystem thesis is and how Electron supports this? And again, how you can use that to achieve flexibility at scale.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, really good point. So maybe use the internet again. So both of them are networks, and they're complex systems with lots of moving parts. And to really scale those types of complex systems up, these complex networks, you need to agree how information and services or energy can be moved around that network. And like you said, as more assets, EVs, consumers are connecting these resources, the network's getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
So just like with the internet, right now we're speaking of the internet, we're using standards like HTTP to send and receive this video call data. That helps us deliver services like Teams and Google Hangout, etc. So we're thinking about it in exactly the same terms in energy. How can we create those standards to allow for energy and the information and services like flexibility to move around the network and to cooperate and coordinate with each other, so that we can really scale this network up? And the valid next question is, why do we need an open ecosystem in flexibility specifically?
Yeah.
You could instead try to figure it all out in a more closed system way, design it all in one place, and just try to build some monolithic solution. And I think that's a really valid question, and I think it's worth reminding everybody that we're kind of running out of time to unlock this net zero future. There isn't enough time, resources, copper, people to build enough grid fast enough to handle all these clean resources that are connecting to the system, which
Absolutely.
which means, okay, we need to move really fast. And we would say that in order to move fast, you need to be able to innovate, and there should be an incentive for innovating. So there should be competition. So the open ecosystem is creating the standards, the rules of the game, so that everyone can compete and innovate together to accelerate the rate of progress and to drive the cost of the energy transition down as much as we possibly can through that competition and innovation, and to
Yeah.
constantly improve the user experience, etc. So, like in internet, again, you've got Google Cloud and Amazon Cloud and Microsoft Cloud. They're all providing really similar cloud services, but they're all fighting really hard to deliver the best possible service at the lowest cost. And so we think, to deliver low cost, just and fast energy transition, we have to have competition and innovation. And in order to have that, you've got to have the standards in place to allow for that collaboration and competition. And then that's why it's so important for the users of the system, the flexibility providers, the end consumers, and the system operators. It's got to be easy for them to do this at scale. We've got to make it as easy as possible to interact with each other and to transact energy and to deliver these services. And that
Yeah.
has to happen through competition and innovation. And standards is the key to that. So when we talk about the open ecosystem, that's what we're trying to promote, the ability for a flex provider to start with platform A, move to platform B, for the DSO to choose platform A one year and move to platform B another year, or in fact use both at the same time, without having to compromise their experience or their flexibility provider's experience. And so that's something we're actively kind of leaning into at Electron.
Yeah. And it's something that you've done really well, not just on the competition side, but on the collaboration side as well. Coming on to more like the actual individual themselves now, how is it that you go about creating those opportunities to allow individuals to engage in flexibility generally? We've already spoken about the open ecosystem and why it's so important. And why is it so important, specifically with reference to aggregators versus coming directly?
Yeah. So again, for me, this is a question of scale. So
Mhm.
how can we help lower barriers to entry so more people can engage with flexibility?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that is true is, or at least I believe, is that most consumers, people like me and you in our day-to-day lives, don't want to or have the time to proactively engage with their energy at the level they would need to actually engage with Flex. So yeah, that's true on the commercial side too. So as individual consumers, we shouldn't have to be monitoring the state of the grid and figuring out when we should be putting our washing machine on. That's nuts and doesn't work. And that's
No
where
one
the
has
role
time.
of yeah, no one's got the time. So that's where the role of aggregators come in. Companies who do have the time and a business model to aggregate all these different consumer level resources or commercial assets, and to take that job on of looking at the needs of the grid and optimizing those assets, taking a small percentage for doing that and delivering value to the system operators and sharing back the revenue to the consumers that take part. So there are retailers like Octopus and Ovo who are doing that for their retail consumers, allowing for shifting of consumption, different times of day, and getting paid and sharing that back to consumers. And then there are commercial aggregators who are doing that for commercial assets. And they all go through a market platform of some form when it comes to flexibility. So that might be ours, or Piclos, or Nodes, or Epex. There's a few of us out there. And most of our flex comes through aggregators for that reason. Sometimes we have direct connected assets, but most of the volume is being delivered through these aggregators. So it's our job as market platforms to figure out how can we make that easy, frictionless, low cost. And this is all about driving more volume and more value into flexibility itself. There's kind of a virtuous circle of, to get more volume, there needs to be value in the market itself. It needs to be attractive for the aggregators. And in order for it to be attractive and compelling, it needs to be low cost to participate, and there needs to be the opportunity to make some revenue. And if there is, more volume turns up, which in turn creates more value, and you get this really positive feedback loop. So that's what we're thinking a lot about. How do we unlock that volume and value in Flex? How do we lower those barriers to entry? And a lot of that historically has been friction up front, spreadsheets, emails, phone calls, quite a lot of manual work to actually engage with flexibility. And you can replace that, like we are doing, with web-based UIs, open APIs, more automation, more integration. And then that ecosystem thing we talked about. So within our platform, we can solve for that, but we can also help providers of flex and aggregators and consumers have a better experience wherever they start, whether they start at Piclo or Electron or vice versa, making it easy for them throughout that journey to engage with flexibility, which is again coming back to why this open ecosystem is so important.
Absolutely. And like you say, creating that sort of full cycle there when it comes to value as well. How much impact then can a business expect from partnering with a company like Electron?
Yeah. So this again is all about volume and value. So flexibility at scale is the goal we're working towards as system operators, as market platform providers. And that means driving more volume and more value into flexibility. And we think there's basically three ways of doing that. More markets for flexibility, doing it more often, and making it more connected. So more markets, more often, more connected. So if you think about more markets first, this means creating more opportunities for flexibility across like a broader range of technology types, for example. So engaging and encouraging a wider range of technology types at different levels of the network, maybe across multiple timeframes, to engage with flexibility. So when we're partnering with customers like Electricity Northwest recently and SSEN, we just publicized that this week. This is giving them the ability to run multiple types of flexibility market at the same time. And that allows them to create more volume of flexibility. And we can start to coordinate those markets between themselves, and again, driving more automation into that. And then the next point is more often. So once you've created more markets for flexibility, you then need to start increasing the frequency of that flexibility. And historically, it's happened a couple of times a year. And it's been this quite manual procurement process. What we're seeing now is this move towards more real-time procurement of flexibility. So day ahead, for example. So most of our customers are looking at how they can move to day ahead markets for flexibility, which means we can bring flexibility closer to the needs of the system and also bring it closer to the capabilities of the flexibility providers. And it's a lot easier for an aggregator who looks after an EV fleet to know what they could do tomorrow than it is for them to commit next year. Like, who knows what their EV fleet's going to do next Tuesday in 2025. So there's a lot of value in bringing markets close to real time more value for the system operator, who has better visibility of what the network needs, and better for the FSP, who has more visibility over what their assets can do. But this comes back to that volume and value point. If you're going to do this a lot more often, it has to be easy to do that. You can't rely on phone calls, spreadsheets, and emails to launch and run these markets. You increasingly need to rely on more automation, more integration. So that's what we've been doing. With ENW as a great example, we've been integrating with their network systems and automating a lot of this process so that we can use less manual intervention and less overhead and oversight to run these flexibility markets, because we can get a real-time feed of what the network needs. They can inform the market, they can create the request for flexibility, that can then be sent by API to the flex providers who can respond programmatically and automatically. And that's the world we see this flexibility space heading towards, of a lot more automation and integration. But still, alongside that more longer term procurement of flex, it still plays a role. It's important to have that more long-term planning and banked flexibility. But again, to meet the needs of the system and to unlock more volume and value, we need to bring that closer to the system needs. So that was more markets, that was more often. And then more connected, which touched a little bit on that. So that's driving more integration and automation within our system. And then keep going on about it, but then the open ecosystem, so connecting market platforms together and allowing FSPs to stack their revenues across multiple markets, across multiple networks at DSO and ESO level. That's going to be really critical. And again, this is all about driving more volume and value into flex. So that's how we think about it. And that's where our customers, I think, are seeing the value. It's allowing them to drive more volume and more value into flexibility by creating more markets more often, more connected.
Yeah. Well, you said there about multiple markets and maybe even multiple time zones, I think is really interesting. Is it going to be possible to expand this internationally? And what will be the sort of challenges that you would face when it comes to international expansion?
Yeah, so I had a lot of experience with this challenge of internationalization at my last company. So I was working at a billing CRM provider, and in every country, there are very specific regulations and very specific data structures and formats that you have to adhere to, which means you could potentially have to re-engineer a lot of the core solution to cater for each individual market.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily true in flexibility. There are less prescribed formats and specific adaptations needed market to market. And that's because the needs of the network are broadly the same. So, it's an engineering and very physical network problem that we're solving. And that is very similar region to region and market to market.
Yeah.
And we've also had a lot of experience at Electron deploying markets in multiple countries around the world, in Canada and America and South Korea, and obviously Europe and the UK. So we kind of deliberately recognize this is going to be a global challenge and needs a global solution. And so we leaned into that and spent the first 5 years or so of our existence figuring out what are the common components you need to run flexibility markets around the world. And you do need to have configuration in the solution. You need to be able to configure the market design and market rules and parameters of the market. But there are definitely building blocks that you can put in place underneath that. So that's how we're solving for it. We're thinking about it in terms of configuration and that like Lego bricks approach to the architecture. And then obviously we're also leaning into the standards too. So whilst the markets are nascent and it's early, and I said there's a kind of a lack of standardization in the way that data is moving around, and that means localization is maybe a bit easier.
Yeah.
We do need those standards, which I've talked a lot about. So that's why we're investing heavily in building those open standards and protocols, because we know that's needed for scale, and we want to be involved in that process and making sure that we're shaping them to support FSPs and DSOs wherever they are and whoever they are, whatever shape and size they are. So we're kind of trying to lead on that standardization for the benefit of that global solution that's needed. But yeah, fundamentally, the needs of the systems are the same. So it's about config and standards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the topic of DSOs, I mean, from your perspective, how important is it? How important are UK regulations and incentives for encouraging DSOs to engage in flexibility?
Yeah, this is hugely important.
Yeah.
So the value of flexibility is a really, really, really important question. So where does the money come from when it comes to flexibility? who's getting paid and how are they getting paid, and where does that money come from in the first place? It's a really good question to ask, and that's why regulations and incentives are so important. If you think about the origins of these network operators, these system operators, historically in a centralized energy system where you've got 100 or less sources of generation and all the energy goes one way, it's a lot easier to command and control that type of system. And so their business models were based largely just around building and reinforcing the network as it was growing over time. And so their incentives were really capex driven. Invest in the network, make a regulated return on that investment, and continue to do that. But now we've got this more dynamic two-way energy system. That simple capex approach doesn't work because you can't build enough fast enough to allow for this transition to happen. So that's where the incentives and the regulations can help, because you can start to incentivize not just capex investment, but OPEX efficiencies. If you can use the existing network more efficiently through flexibility, you should be rewarded for that and incentivized to do that. And that's where the value of flexibility, or part of the value of flexibility, is realized and starts, allowing DSOs to be rewarded for creating more capacity on the existing network and then sharing that benefit to the aggregators, the flex providers, to the consumers who are providing it. So the UK has done a lot of great work in that space and is leading in a lot of ways to set those incentives. And thankfully, the European markets and US markets are following quickly behind them. There's already directives in the EU and in the US to start to incentivize that. And people call it TOTEX, so a kind of total expenditure, not just capital or operational. So that TOTEX regime is, we think, a really important building block or component of those incentives. And wherever that exists, you can start to see the adoption of flex increase, and then the value of flex again increases. And this is how we think we get to scale. So we spend a lot of time engaged with the regulators and the industry to continue to push the envelope on what those incentives look like and to identify where those pots of value are. But yeah, that plays a massive role in this transition, because you're asking these traditional capex businesses to shift their business model fundamentally, and that means making sure they're incentivized to go on that journey.
Yeah, no, and it's so important because ultimately we want to keep encouraging more people to engage with flexibility in the long term. I mean, we did sort of touch on this earlier, but in the UK market particularly, talk to me more about how flexibility patterns are changing. You already talked about the move towards more sort of real-time dynamic markets. But what's been some of the key changes that we've seen in that sort of in the recent years?
Yeah. So I think the evolution has been, in the very early days, it was like a one-to-one contract you'd have in place with like a large factory. You'd say, hey, can you turn down at this time of day next year for the next 5 years? One-to-one contract relationships. And then we moved to like enrollment portals and tools that made it easier to see where those opportunities are and easier to contract for those types of flexibility over a longer time frame. But still quite far ahead, a couple of times a year, like I said, and still when it comes to dispatching and making that flexibility real, pretty manual. Now we're moving to this world of more real-time procurement of flex, like we talked about. So moving to day ahead is a trend that we're seeing. And like I said, we're seeing that because in order to unlock more value and volume from flex, you need to bring it closer to the needs of the system and closer to the capabilities of the providers of flex themselves. So we think there's a kind of a natural ceiling to how much flexibility you can activate over a long time horizon. If you're asking for it next year or over the next 5 years, only so many people are going to turn up, because only so many people have the risk appetite and the assets around to deliver that type of flex. But like I said, it does play a really important role from a planning perspective to know that for the next 5 years, you have some flexibility banked. And it would be impossible to live day by day trying to figure out your flex needs and go through that whole process. So we're seeing that evolution of manual to more automated to more real time, but that we also are seeing no one is stopping that long-term flex procurement. It still plays a really valuable role, and that's bringing in, I guess, some interesting dynamics that maybe for a time people thought it would just all move to day ahead and that would solve the problem. But if you need to run multiple markets at the same time, this makes DSOs and FSBs think about how they can engage with multiple markets at the same time. How easy is it for a DSO to run multiple markets if it's very manual, it's really difficult. So that's where the need to be more coordinated and automated between the markets becomes important. So we're seeing more and more emphasis on automation and integration between systems, because if we're going to run multiple markets for Flex, they need to talk to each other, and it needs to be easy for the DSO and the FSP to navigate that. So yeah, surface level shift from far ahead to more real time, but because of that, a need to focus more on automation and integration so that that's possible and can be done at scale.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a constantly changing and adapting market. It's going through an evolution. It could go through, several more evolutions in the future. A big one that a lot of people have asked, how is this going to affect flexibility, is the rise of EVs and electrification. In your, in your view, how is that going to affect flexibility? How are those two going to work together?
Yeah, it's such a great catalyst, I think, for the energy transition, and also just a really great example of how decentralized this transition is. So it's happening bottom up. It's happening whether or not the system operators like it. They can't control the adoption of electric vehicles, and uniquely, they're these two-way bi-directional power stations on wheels that are driving around the grid. So it's completely flipping the dynamic of the energy system, and it's happening bottom up, not top down. So it's one, accelerating the energy transition, but it's also accelerating the challenges that come along with flexibility, or rather with this more clean, renewable energy system, more intermittent, more variable, more dynamic. So EVs play a really critical role in driving the energy transition forwards, because it's going to happen regardless, and it's increasingly happening faster and faster. And this theme of electrification, this is just one example. We're electrifying transport, we're electrifying heat. It's going to happen in every vertical. So the job is, again, thinking back to unlocking Flex at scale and driving more volume and value into flexibility, making sure that we can actually unlock the value of EVs, and that we can make use of these amazing features that they have, this battery on wheels that can be charged and discharged whenever the grid needs it. And at scale, it's crazy how much energy we could actually tap into if we were to engage electric vehicles at scale. So it just puts more and more emphasis again on the need for more standardization and this ecosystem to exist, so that wherever an EV is, whichever part of the network and whoever they're being supplied by or aggregated by, that the experience and the experience of the consumer is easy, the experience for the provider or the aggregator is easy, and that it's matching the needs of the system. So you can see it's all converging on the need for more volume and value in Flex, and that is underpinned by an open ecosystem, which is more automated and more integrated. So we think EVs are just kind of the tip of the spear that's driving this energy transition, and it's happening all over the world. And it's just a great example of this democratization of energy. And I guess that's why it's so interesting. And I'm really excited to be working in this sector and for working at Electron and working with DSOs, because it feels like we're at the heart of this change, and DSOs are at the coalface of that change, to use a fossil fuel analogy. So they're literally at the forefront of this change. They're having to completely transform their businesses digitally and physically to make it happen. So DSOs are the kind of, in my eyes, the unsung heroes of the transition, and they're going to play an absolutely critical role in making it happen. So we're really excited to be partnering with ENW and SSEN and NGED and others, because they're the game changers that are going to make this happen at scale, and they're the ones that are leaning into this opportunity to use EVs and wind and solar to create more capacity on the network and share that with consumers. So yeah, really exciting time, and DSOs in a really, really exciting place to make that all happen.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think talking about the future and obviously all the positive things that can potentially come out of it is a really good place to end this, end it on a high, and thinking about the places that this can go in the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this. It's been amazing to hear your thoughts on it, obviously as an expert in the space. Yeah, I'll have to join you again on the next one.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lily. Good to talk to you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.